Usually when you walk into a typical courtroom, there's a very strict, almost mechanical expectation of how the proceedings will operate.
Right, a highly structured environment.
Yeah, you have the judge sitting at the bench, you have the accused sitting at the defense table, and you have the evidence presented for all to see.
And everyone knows their role.
Precisely. If that evidence clearly demonstrates guilt, like if the fingerprints are on the weapon or if the witnesses all corroborate the story, the outcome is fixed.
The judge brings down the gavel.
Right, the gavel comes down, issues the penalty, and the guilty party is led away in handcuffs. It is an absolute binary system.
It has to be, or the system collapses.
Yeah, acquittal in any functioning human justice system is a verdict reserved strictly for the innocent.
Innocent people go free. Guilty people pay the price.
But then you step into the theological courtroom of the Apostle Paul, and suddenly that conventional legal machinery operates in a staggering, counterintuitive way.
It flips the entire concept of a courtroom on its head.
It really does. We are looking at a judicial landscape where the judge does not hand down a self-help manual.
He is not asking for better behavior.
Right. He does not demand better future behavior from the guilty in exchange for leniency. Instead, the judge issues a forensic verdict of complete acquittal to the guilty party by providing the very perfection required to satisfy the standard of justice.
Which is mind-blowing when you really stop and think about it.
It is. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Our goal today for you, the listener, is to examine a heavy stack of notes drawn from R.C.H. Lenski's massive commentary on the Apostle Paul's Epistle to the Romans.
Specifically focusing entirely on Chapter 1 today.
Yes, Chapter 1. We want to analyze the core mechanics of forensic justification by faith alone.
And simultaneously, we need to look at the terrifying, dark backdrop that makes this justification so urgently necessary.
Right, the stark reality of total human depravity. For you listening right now, these are doctrines central to the Westminster Confession, and understanding them requires us to look unflinchingly at the text.
We cannot look away from the harsh parts.
No, we cannot. So I am looking at how Paul begins this letter, and it strikes me as an incredibly dense salutation.
He packs a lot into those opening lines.
He does. Before he lists any apostolic credentials, before he mentions any authority, he introduces himself first as a slave, or doulos, of Jesus Christ.
That specific word choice is deliberate.
Yeah, and I am trying to wrap my head around this opening move. Rome was a city completely obsessed with status.
Oh, status was everything. It was their whole social currency.
Right. So why would a royal ambassador, possessing the highest office in the early church, introduce himself to the capital of the known world as a peasant, completely owned by a foreign king?
Well, Lenski goes into rigorous detail to explain its weight. To understand it, you have to realize what the Greek word doulos meant in that specific first-century Roman context.
It meant more than just a servant, right?
Oh, absolutely. It carries a distinct meaning of absolute, unmitigated ownership. You see, Paul was a Roman citizen by birth.
Which was a big deal.
A massive deal. That citizenship held rights that were highly prized, rights that people paid absolute fortunes to acquire.
Yet he just bypasses his civic status entirely to declare himself a slave.
Yeah, Lenski points out that Paul uses this term to strike the full Christian note immediately.
So he is leveling the playing field?
Precisely. He is putting himself on the exact same level as the Roman believers to whom he is writing. He does not elevate himself above them in his first breath.
He identifies with them.
Yes, as someone who has been purchased at a price, someone who possesses no independent will outside the will of his master.
I mean, an employee clocks out at the end of the day and goes home to live his own life.
But a doulos never clocks out. His time, his body, and his will belong entirely to the one who bought him.
That makes me think of an analogy. Imagine a man who is a conquering general, someone with immense authority, walking into a room full of dignitaries.
Okay, picture that.
But instead of wearing his chest full of medals, he walks in carrying a massive, heavy iron chain. And he treats that chain as his most prized possession.
Wow, yeah.
He displays the branding mark of his owner before he ever shows his badge of office. He is essentially saying, before I tell you about my authority over you, let me tell you who possesses complete authority over me.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. It is only after establishing this shared status of complete submission that Paul lists his specific credential as a called apostle, or kleos apostolos.
And Lenski is very careful to note the grammar here, isn't he?
Yes, because the grammar dictates the theology. Called functions like a passive participle.
Meaning Paul did not volunteer for this role.
Right. He did not submit a resume or work his way up a corporate ladder. He was sovereignly drafted by Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus.
The calling happened to him.
Yeah, he was the recipient of the action.
That passive element is crucial because it takes the focus off Paul's initiative and puts it entirely on God's sovereignty.
Which is a very reformed understanding.
Absolutely, and that leads directly to the message he is authorized to carry. Lenski notes that this gospel was promised in advance through the prophets in the Holy Scriptures.
The commentary highlights the specific use of the Greek preposition laia, meaning through.
Which points directly to the verbal inspiration of the Old Testament text, right?
Yes. God is the author, speaking through the prophets as his chosen medium. They are the instruments, but the voice is divine.
Now, the contents of this promised gospel are strictly focused on the Son, moving through two distinct states.
Lenski outlines these as the state of humiliation and the state of exaltation.
I want to push back on the terminology here, though.
Sure, God.
Paul writes that the Son came from David's seed according to the flesh.
Right.
But in a lot of Paul's writings, the word flesh is used to describe the sinful human nature. So, does this imply that Jesus inherited a sinful nature?
No, that is an excellent clarification to make because confusing the definitions there leads to massive theological errors.
Which we want to avoid.
Yes. Lenski is adamant that the Greek phrase katasaka, meaning according to the flesh, does not imply sinfulness in this specific context.
Okay, so what does it mean here?
Instead, it refers to the genuine physical and human reality Christ assumed. The eternal Son of God entered into the severe limitations, the frailty, and the lowliness of human existence.
Specifically fulfilling the messianic royal line of David.
Exactly. Precisely. That is the state of humiliation. The infinite God confining himself to a human matrix.
Then you have the second state, the state of exaltation.
Right. Paul writes that Christ was ordained as God's Son in divine might, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead.
And Lenski draws a critical theological boundary here. He rejects any Apollinarian notion regarding the phrase Spirit of holiness.
He really does.
Wait, I need you to pause and define that. For the listener, what is the Apollinarian notion, and why does Lenski feel the need to reject it right here in the opening verses?
Okay, so Apollinarianism was an early church heresy proposed by Apollinaris of Laodicea.
A mouthful of a name.
Yeah. He tried to explain the incarnation by claiming that Jesus had a normal human body, but that the divine logos took the place of the regular human mind or rational soul.
So like a divine mind in a human shell.
Right. He thought this protected Christ's divinity. But the Orthodox Church rejected it completely, reasoning that what is not assumed is not healed.
Oh, meaning if Jesus did not have a human mind, he could not redeem human minds.
Spot on. Lenski points out that the phrase Spirit of holiness in this verse does not mean the Holy Spirit replaced Christ's human spirit.
What does it mean then?
It refers to the perfect, holy obedience Christ rendered throughout his earthly life in his human spirit, an obedience which culminated in the resurrection.
So through the resurrection, the Son transitioned from the lowly state of human weakness, the flesh, into the exalted state of divine might.
Yes. The resurrection is the vindication of his perfect human obedience.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And that transition from humiliation to exaltation sets the stage for the sheer scale of Paul's mission.
Because Paul is completely owned by this exalted, resurrected king.
Yeah, he carries an inescapable obligation to the king's subjects. This obligation drives his global mission and moves us directly into the apostolic debt.
It is a massive debt.
Paul writes to the Romans that he thanks God for them, that their faith is proclaimed worldwide, and that he prays unceasingly to finally visit them.
But then he declares himself to be a debtor.
Right, a debtor to the Greeks and to the barbarians, to the wise and to the foolish alike.
Rome was the absolute, undisputed center of the known world at that time.
Yet Lenski points out that to Paul, it was just another location containing the same two categories of humanity found everywhere else.
In the political and cultural grouping of the Roman Empire, humanity was divided by the elite into two broad categories, Greeks and barbarians.
What did that actually mean on the ground?
Well, Greeks referred to anyone possessing Hellenistic culture, philosophy, and education, regardless of their actual geographic ethnicity.
So if you spoke Greek, read Homer, and understood Stoic philosophy, you were in the club.
Yeah, exactly. You were considered cultured. Barbarians, on the other hand, referred to the uncultured natives, the massive populations of slaves, the rural peasants, and those outside the Greek intellectual sphere.
Lenski explains that this linguistic division covered all of humanity,
And Paul places himself under a massive, crushing debt to both groups.
which is the paradox of the apostolic office, right? This
Yeah.
internal compulsion to preach.
Yes. The educated elites in the forums needed the perceived foolishness of the gospel to shatter their pride.
And the uneducated masses in the slums needed the divine wisdom it offered to lift them out of despair.
Paul owes this gospel to every single social class. He is eager to discharge this debt in Rome, treating the imperial capital with the exact same gospel urgency as he would a remote provincial outpost in Galatia.
I find the logic of that debt fascinating because it operates completely backward to normal human economics.
How so?
Well, typically, paying off a financial debt leaves a person with less money. If I owe the bank $10,000, writing that check empties my bank account and leaves me poor.
Right, you lose resources.
But discharging this spiritual debt operates more like a farmer planting seeds.
I like that.
Imagine a farmer who inherits 10 tons of grain. If he hoards that grain in a silo, trying to protect his wealth, it eventually rots or gets eaten by rats.
It becomes useless.
Yeah. The only way to secure a massive harvest, the only way to actually generate true abundance, is to continuously give the seeds away, throwing them into the dirt.
So paying off the apostolic debt enriches the one paying it.
Yes, because it produces the obedience of faith among the nations. And to pay this immense global debt in the capital of the Roman Empire, Paul brings a very specific currency.
He does not bring Greek philosophy.
He did not bring Roman political theory. He brings a saving force. In Romans 1:16, Paul declares he is not ashamed of the gospel.
He is not ashamed because he knows precisely what the gospel actually is.
Lenski untacks the Greek term dunamis, which Paul uses here, right?
He does. It translates to a mighty force or an active divinity. Now, Lenski's very careful to distinguish this from raw divine omnipotence.
What is the difference?
Raw omnipotence is the force that spoke galaxies into existence. If God applied raw omnipotence to sinful humanity, it would not save sinners.
It would just crush them under the weight of infinite justice.
Right. The gospel, rather, is the specific, concentrated force of God's saving grace. It is the active operating instrument that rescues humanity from the damning consequences of sin.
And this force operates effectively for everyone believing.
But the core mechanism of this salvation, the actual way it works, is revealed in verse 17.
Where Paul introduces the concept of dikaiosune theo, the righteousness of God.
Yes. And Lenski stresses over and over that this is a forensic, judicial term.
It is a legal verdict of acquittal.
Completely legal.
I really want to stop and examine this forensic reality because it is the hinge on which the entire Reformed understanding of Scripture turns.
It is the core issue.
And we use the courtroom analogy. I often hear people confused by the terminology.
Sure, it can be tricky.
Like, if I am a guilty defendant, standing before a judge with my crimes fully proven, how can a perfectly just judge strike the gavel and declare a legal verdict of righteous without violating his own standard of justice?
Doesn't that make God a corrupt judge, letting the guilty go free?
Exactly. I mean, how do we answer that?
Well, that is the tension that terrified Martin Luther before the Reformation. If the righteousness of God means the standard God demands of us, then we are all doomed, because we can never meet it.
We fall short every time.
Right. But Lenski notes that this righteousness is not a human works-based achievement. It is also not an infused substance.
What do you mean by infused substance?
The medieval church taught that God infused grace into a person, making them internally morally better over time. And if they cooperated enough, they might eventually be righteous enough to be saved.
Which puts the burden back on the sinner.
Yes. Lenski, following the Reformed tradition, completely rejects that. Forensic justification means it is an objective, legal status bestowed by God the judge.
So the standard of justice is not ignored.
Not at all. It is perfectly satisfied by the substitute, Jesus Christ. His perfect obedience and his atoning death are credited or imputed to the defendant's account.
Ah, so the judge is completely just in declaring the defendant righteous.
Because the penalty has been paid and the law has been fulfilled, just not by the defendant.
That makes the distinction incredibly sharp. It is an external righteousness applied to my record, not an internal renovation that I have to maintain to stay out of trouble.
Yes, an alien righteousness.
And Paul says this status is received from faith to faith. Lenski makes it clear that this faith is entirely non-synergistic.
Meaning, we do not cooperate with God to generate a little bit of faith, and then God tops off the rest.
Right. The gospel itself, that dunamis force, creates the faith within the dead human heart.
And that faith is completely filled by its object, which is Christ. Faith is just the empty hand receiving the verdict.
Precisely. Paul anchors this New Testament revelation firmly in the Old Testament by quoting Habakkuk 2.4. The righteous shall live from faith.
Lenski provides excellent historical context here regarding Habakkuk.
Yeah, the prophet Habakkuk was contrasting the arrogant, self-sufficient Chaldean invaders with the righteous person.
The Chaldean relies on his own military strength, his own achievements, and ultimately faces destruction.
While the righteous person relies entirely on God's promise and receives life.
The Greek preposition ek, meaning out of or from, is vital here. Justification springs out of faith. It is the sole instrument of reception.
Lenski insists on a chronological and logical absolute here, doesn't he?
He really does. He says no human being is righteous for even 1 millisecond before he has faith, nor does he have faith for even 1 millisecond before God declares him righteous.
Wow, so the legal pronouncement, the creation of faith, and the impartation of spiritual life all occur simultaneously.
In the instant the gospel force penetrates the heart.
But why is this rescue mission so desperately required? I mean, a forensic acquittal is only necessary if you are facing catastrophic legal danger.
And we are.
This moves us away from the solution and into the terrifying reality of the human condition. In Romans 1.180, Paul pivots sharply away from the grace of the gospel and looks at the sky.
It is a harsh pivot.
He writes that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness.
We have to look closely at this concept of divine wrath.
Yeah, because modern sensibilities constantly try to sanitize it, apologize for it, or explain it away as some primitive Old Testament concept that Jesus somehow did away with.
But Lenski refuses to sanitize it, and neither does the Westminster Confession.
So what is the Greek phrase used here?
It is orge theo, the wrath of God. And it's presented not as a petty, unpredictable, emotional outburst.
It is not God losing his temper because humanity annoyed him.
Right. It is the constant, unchanging, and absolute reaction of God's perfect holiness against sin.
Like how light naturally destroys darkness.
Yes. Holiness naturally and violently opposes sin. Lenski points out the present tense of the verb is revealed.
That is a crucial grammatical detail.
It is. This is not a wrath reserved exclusively for a distant final judgment at the end of time.
It is a current, ongoing revelation.
Yes, God's opposition to sin is constantly breaking through into human history, into societal collapse, and into the human conscience right now.
The text states that this wrath is directed against ungodliness, which is irreligion, or the internal rejection of God's authority, and unrighteousness, which is immorality, or the outward violation of God's standard of right.
The internal attitude always produces the outward action.
But the most chilling action of humanity is found in the verb katechin,
which means to hold down or suppress.
Lenski observes that men actively, aggressively suppress the truth about God, because acknowledging that truth would require them to abandon their unrighteousness.
They hold it down on purpose.
I picture it like a man trying to hold down a tightly coiled, heavy-duty industrial spring.
Oh, that is a good visual.
The spring represents the reality of God's existence and moral law. It is constantly trying to pop up into human conscience.
It just will not stay down.
Right. It constantly asserts its presence. Every time a person looks at the stars, or feels a pang of guilt, or witnesses the birth of a child.
But the rebellious human uses all his strength.
Yeah, all his philosophical arguments, all his scientific theories, and all his cultural conditioning to force that spring down, to sit on it, to suppress it.
Which brings up the argument of the innocent pagan.
We hear that all the time today. The idea that people living on a remote island cannot possibly be held accountable by a just God if they have never read a Bible or heard the name of Jesus.
But Paul aggressively dismantles that entire concept of innocent ignorance.
He does. He claims that the natural knowledge of God is abundantly clear. He writes that the invisible things of God, specifically his everlasting might and divinity, are perceived fully through the things he has made.
It is an incredible oxymoron. The unseen things are fully seen.
Creation shouts the reality of the Creator so loudly that all humanity is left entirely without excuse.
Lenski's analysis of the Greek terminology here is highly instructive for understanding human psychology.
What does he focus on?
He points out that this perception happens through nous, the mind. It is a mental apprehension derived inevitably from observing the physical universe.
So from the creation of the world onward, the sheer scale of the cosmos, the intricate design of biology, and the mathematical consistency of physics.
They all function as a massive, unavoidable, blazing billboard for the Creator's existence and his eternal attributes.
Every single human being possesses this natural theology. God has wired it into their consciousness.
Therefore, the suppression of this truth is not a tragic accident of geography.
It is not innocent ignorance.
No, it is a hostile, deliberate act of the human will. And when a human being violently holds down the clear reality of the Creator, their mind cannot just remain a blank slate.
It requires a substitute reality.
Yes. This deliberate rejection triggers a catastrophic cognitive chain reaction, which Paul outlines next.
So what happens when you hold the spring down? What happens to a mind that wages war against reality?
Paul writes that because men knew God but refused to glorify him or give him thanks, their reasonings became empty and their senseless hearts were darkened.
Lenski unpacks this downward intellectual spiral with devastating clarity.
The refusal to worship leads directly, inevitably, to cognitive failure.
The Greek word mataios is used for their reasonings.
Meaning they became empty, futile, failing to reach any valid conclusion.
I think of an analogy involving a brilliant physicist or mathematician. Imagine a scientist trying to calculate the orbital physics of a black hole, but for some stubborn personal reason, he completely refuses to acknowledge the law of gravity.
Okay, that math is going to get weird fast.
Right. He can fill dozens of chalkboards with incredibly complex equations. He can use the most advanced calculus known to man. But because he has rejected the bedrock foundational principle of the physical system, his math eventually becomes absurd.
It yields pure nonsense.
Yeah, in the exact same way, human philosophy, political theory, and sociological reasoning, no matter how sophisticated or academically credentialed it appears, becomes empty and absurd the moment it removes the creator from the equation.
The irony Paul highlights in the text is razor sharp. He writes, claiming to be wise, they became silly fools.
The Greek verb moreno is used there.
Yes, which is where we get the word moron. It literally means they became silly or foolish.
While loudly boasting of their intellectual superiority, their enlightenment, and their scientific rationale, humanity descends into the ultimate intellectual degradation.
And what is the concrete historical manifestation of this foolishness? Paul states they traded the glory of the incorruptible God for image likenesses of corruptible men, birds, four-footed beasts, and creeping reptiles.
Lenski emphasizes the supreme, almost comical folly of this exchange.
It is insane. They take the infinite, imperishable fountain of eternal blessing, the sovereign God of the universe, and they trade him for a piece of carved wood or stone shaped like a snake or a cow.
Man was made in the image of God to rule over the animals.
But in his rebellion, man makes God in the image of the lowest crawling brutes, and then bows his own head down to worship them.
Think of the Egyptian pantheon, with their jackal and bird heads, or the Roman emperors demanding worship while living completely debased lives.
It is the ultimate bad bargain.
It is a complete collapse of rational thought, driven not by a lack of intelligence, but by a desperate, blinding desire to avoid moral accountability to the true God.
Faced with this absurd, deliberate, and frankly insulting rejection, God responds.
And his response is quite surprising. He does not send immediate fire and brimstone from the sky.
No, his justice enacts a far more terrifying penalty.
3 times in the following verses, Paul repeats a chilling phrase: God gave them up.
This is not passive permission.
Right. It is an act of judicial sentencing from the bench. First, God hands them over in the lusts of their hearts to uncleanness, to dishonor their own bodies.
Second, he hands them over to vile passions.
Where females and males exchange natural relations for those contrary to nature, receiving the due recompense in their own bodies.
I want to look closely at how Lenski interprets this action of God handing humanity over to sin.
Yeah, because it sounds almost like God is forcing people to do evil, which contradicts his holy nature.
Lenski frames this carefully within the Reformed view of judgment, focusing on the doctrine of total depravity.
The Greek verb is perdoken.
Yes, gave them up. It indicates a judicial removal of divine restraint. God does not inject fresh evil into anyone's heart, nor does he force anyone to sin against their will.
So what is he actually doing?
He removes his common restraining grace. He takes his hands off the steering wheel and allows human depravity to run its natural, devastating, chosen course.
Is the principle of sin being used to punish sin?
When men violently demand absolute autonomy and reject God's moral governance, God's ultimate, most severe judgment is simply to grant their request.
He hands them over to the very lusts they cherish.
Lenski notes that Paul's text is reticent in its language, but completely unyielding in its description of sexual degradation.
Paul views the violation of nature not merely as a private personal failing, but as a glaring systemic symptom of a society that has thoroughly abandoned its creator.
The logic is clear. When the truth of God is exchanged for a lie in the spiritual realm, the natural order is simultaneously exchanged for the unnatural in the physical realm.
The body follows the theology.
Always.
You know, I sometimes struggle to communicate why this is a punishment. If men and women are doing exactly what their fallen, corrupted nature passionately desires to do, how can that be considered a penalty?
It is a fair question.
Let me offer an analogy to see if it tracks with Lenski's exegesis. Imagine a rebellious sailor on a massive ship navigating through a lethal, storm-tossed, freezing sea.
Okay.
The sailor hates the captain, he hates the strict rules of the ship, and he demands to jump overboard into the violent water because he is convinced the ocean represents true, unrestrained freedom.
A terrible idea.
Yeah. The captain tries to hold him back, pointing out the jagged rocks and the freezing temperatures, but the sailor is violently determined to jump.
So what does the captain do?
The captain's ultimate, most severe punishment is not to throw the sailor in the brig. The worst punishment is simply to remove the physical guardrails, step aside, and say, jump.
Wow.
The sailor gets exactly what he wants, but what he wants is the very thing that will drown him.
That is a very grim but accurate picture. The physical and social degradation Paul describes is the outward, visible symptom of a total internal cognitive collapse.
A mind that rejects reality produces a society that rejects nature.
And that internal collapse leads us into the concept of the reprobate mind. The text moves from the physical actions back to the root mental state.
In verse 28, Paul writes that because they refused to have God in their realization, God handed them over to a reprobate mind to do things not fit.
Lenski highlights a brilliant, stinging Greek wordplay here that gets lost in English translation.
Oh, I love looking at the original Greek wordplay. What is it?
The humans reprobated God. The Greek word is adokimasan, meaning they tested him, weighed him in the balances, and rejected him as unworthy of their worship.
And God responds in kind.
Yes. In direct, symmetrical response, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, adokimon, a mind that is entirely unfit, tested by God, and rejected as worthless.
That wordplay regarding the reprobate mind, the adokimon, makes me think of the ancient Roman practice of testing coinage.
Like biting a gold coin.
Yeah, exactly. In the ancient world, merchants would test silver or gold coins to ensure they weren't counterfeit, shaved down, or mixed with cheap, worthless metals like lead.
Right.
If a coin failed the test, it was deemed reprobate. It was tossed into the scrap heap, utterly useless for any legitimate commerce.
So Paul is pointing out that the human intellect tested the concept of God and foolishly decided God had no value.
Yes. Therefore, God took the human intellect, declared it morally counterfeit, and threw it onto the scrap heap.
And what does a scrap heap mind produce?
It produces a scrap heap culture. Following this, Lenski categorizes the 21 specific vices Paul lists to demonstrate that this is not a random, chaotic assortment of bad behaviors thrown together to sound scary.
No, it is a comprehensive, systemic indictment of human society in its fallen state.
Can you break down the specific groupings of these 21 vices that Lenski identifies? Because reading them all in one breath can be overwhelming.
Sure. Lenski organizes them meticulously into 4 distinct rhetorical groups to show the total saturation of sin.
What is the first group?
The first group consists of 4 nouns focusing on underlying qualities of character: unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, and baseness.
So this shows the internal corruption of the moral compass before any outward action even occurs.
Right. The second group is composed of 5 terms highlighting malicious actions and attitudes: envy, murder, strife, cunning, and malevolence.
Notice the psychological insight there. An internal attitude like envy is placed right alongside a violent outward atrocity like murder.
Paul is showing they spring from the exact same reprobate root.
What about the third group?
The third group shifts to arrogant, destructive postures toward others: slanderous whisperers, insolent people, arrogant boasters, and inventors of cruelties.
Inventors of cruelties. I think of the Roman gladiatorial games. They literally invented new ways to be cruel just for entertainment.
Absolutely. And finally, the fourth group highlights the severe breakdown of fundamental relationships: disobedient to parents, senseless, faithless, loveless, and merciless.
I want to stop on that fourth group for a second. Disobedient to parents.
It stands out, doesn't it?
It almost feels out of place. You have murder, inventing cruelties, and malevolence. And then you have a teenager talking back to their mom. Why does Paul elevate filial disobedience to the same catastrophic level as murder?
Well, Lenski makes a very poignant observation regarding that specific placement. Filial disobedience, rebelling against the authority of parents, is a foundational fracture of all human society.
Because the family is the basic unit of civilization.
Right. If a child's mind is so reprobate that they cannot respect and obey the immediate visible authority of the parents who gave them life and shelter, they will never respect the invisible authority of God.
Nor will they respect the civic authority of the state.
Lenski demonstrates that the root of societal collapse does not begin with bad government policies or foreign invasions.
It begins in the home, in the fracture of the most basic human bonds.
Once the family structure is despised, the descent into a merciless, loveless society is guaranteed.
It is a devastating, bleak portrait. And Lenski insists that Paul is not just describing the ancient pagan world of Nero's Rome.
No, he is describing the perpetual, natural state of humanity apart from the intervening grace of God.
A discarded reprobate mind does not simply commit crimes in the shadows and feel guilty about them. It actively builds an entire culture that normalizes and celebrates the rebellion.
Which brings us to the climax of the chapter, the absolute bottom of the downward spiral.
Yes, Paul concludes this terrifying chapter in verse 32. He states that men realize God's righteous ordinance that those practicing such things are worthy of death.
They know it.
Yet, they not only keep performing these acts, they actually applaud and encourage others who practice them.
This verse is the absolute zenith of total depravity.
Lenski stresses that at this stage, the excuse of ignorance is completely, permanently eliminated.
The human conscience, despite being darkened, despite being reprobate and handed over, still retains the inescapable judicial reality of God's law.
Deep down, they know the penalty is death. They know the bridge is out ahead.
Yet, the climax of their depravity is the social reinforcement of sin.
What is the Greek verb used for that?
It is synodokio. It means to deem with others that something is well done, to give enthusiastic consent, to cheer, to applaud.
It is the deliberate, communal celebration of behaviors that they internally know are fatal.
They validate each other in their rebellion. They throw parades for their vices.
Why do they do that?
Because there is safety in numbers. They applaud the sins of others to drown out the lingering, agonizing voice of their own conscience.
It requires a shocking, almost unimaginable level of malice to reach that point.
It really does.
I mean, it is tragic enough for a man to sit alone in a dark room and drink a vial of poison because he is deceived or depressed. That is a tragedy.
A terrible tragedy.
But it is a completely different, horrifying level of pure malice to host a lavish banquet, hand out glasses of poison to all your friends and family, raise a toast, and cheer wildly while everyone drinks it together.
Knowing full well it will kill every single person in the room.
Yeah. That is the picture Paul paints of human culture applauding rebellion against God, the mutual celebration of spiritual suicide.
And that is the theological genius of Paul's letter to the Romans, as Lenski so masterfully demonstrates.
Paul has painted this devastating, inescapable picture of universal human guilt for one specific strategic reason.
To completely destroy any notion that a human being can possibly save themselves by their own merit or intellect.
The complete ruin of the human mind, the total bondage of the human will to sin, and the terrifying present reality of God's wrath make one thing absolutely clear.
If the judge does not intervene to provide the righteousness himself, we are all left cheering at the poisoned banquet.
The darkness of chapter 1 is strictly required to make the blinding light of the forensic justification in chapter 3 shine with its true intensity.
The law condemns universally, stripping away every excuse so that grace may save selectively through faith alone.
The legal gavel must strike, but the verdict we deserve would ruin us. Therefore, the verdict of Christ is our only hope.
The only hope we have.
For you listening, consider how modern society continues to invent new idols and new ways to applaud rebellion. The ancient wooden statues of creeping reptiles might be gone from our modern cities, but the worship of total autonomy, the worship of the human intellect, and the worship of physical desire remain exactly the same.
The objects change, but the reprobate mind functions in the same predictable patterns.
If the wrath of God is revealed constantly in the visible breakdown of human logic, in the fracture of the family, and in the normalization of cruelty today, how much more urgent is the objective reality of the gospel verdict for you right now?
It is a question that demands an answer.
If the courtroom is real and the evidence of human guilt is overwhelming, the only thing that matters is how you stand before the judge. Thank you for listening to this deep dive on Reformed thinking.